New York City. J.P. Morgan writes a check for $480 million. It is the largest personal check ever written in the history of American commerce at that point, and it purchases exactly one thing: a steel company. The man selling it is Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who arrived in America at age 13 with nothing, who worked his first job as a telegraph messenger boy in Pittsburgh at $1.20 per week, and who has built the most efficient industrial enterprise in human history. Carnegie Steel produces more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. Its profit margin is double what any competitor can match. Its cost per ton of finished rail is lower than anyone thought was possible when Carnegie started building. And Carnegie is selling it not because it is failing, but because he has won completely. There is nobody left to compete against the check. Morgan writes represents roughly 1.4% of the entire United States GDP in 1901. In today's terms, that is somewhere between $350 and $500 billion. It is the number that Morgan needs to pay to prevent Carnegie from simply building more plants, cutting prices further, and destroying every other steel company in America until nothing is left. Carnegie could do it. Everyone involved knows he could do it. The check is the price of peace, and the strategy that puts Carnegie in the position to extract that price, the strategy of owning every single step of the production process from the iron, or in the ground, to the finished rail in the customer's hands, is the strategy that every dominant industrial company since 1901 has tried to replicate, and that every antitrust regulator since 1901 has tried to limit, and that the 5 largest technology companies in the world are running right now on digital rails instead of steel ones. How does a telegraph messenger boy become the man who forces the most powerful banker in America to write a $500 million check? And why does the specific competitive weapon Carnegie invents in the 1870s and 1880s keep producing the same dominance pattern in every industry it touches, from oil to telephones to search engines to social media? This is the story of Carnegie Steel. By the end, you will understand how vertical integration converts cost advantages into permanent market positions. See the specific mechanism that made Carnegie's empire unbeatable on price, and recognize the version of this strategy that is consolidating entire sectors of the modern economy right now. But to understand how this happened, you have to go back, way back. It is the late 1860s, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the city stinks. Coal smoke from the iron furnaces coats every surface, blackens every building, irritates every set of lungs within a 10-mile radius. The Monongahela and Allegheny rivers carry industrial waste alongside the barges loaded with pig iron and limestone. The air smells of sulfur and burning coke. Workers in the mills are large men made larger by the physical demands of a job that requires moving molten metal in environments where the ambient temperature runs above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and a single misstep means death. Pittsburgh in 1868 is not a beautiful place. It is a necessary place, the industrial heartland of a country that is rebuilding itself after a civil war that killed 600,000 people and left railroads, bridges, and industrial infrastructure in ruins across half the continent. The American steel industry, in 1868, runs on something called the puddling process, a method of producing wrought iron and small quantities of steel that is labor-intensive, skill-dependent, and fundamentally limited in scale. A skilled puddler, the iron worker who stirs the molten iron in a furnace to burn off impurities, can produce roughly 500 pounds of iron per shift. That is the ceiling. You can add more puddlers and more furnaces, but the process cannot be mechanized and it cannot be substantially accelerated. The iron industry in 1868 employs tens of thousands of highly skilled workers whose individual skill is the bottleneck on production. Carnegie watches this system and sees in it a vulnerability that most of the men who run it are too invested in to recognize. The American economy in 1868 is being rebuilt on steel rails. The Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869. The expansion of the rail network across the Midwest and the South requires hundreds of thousands of miles of track, and track requires steel. Steel is stronger than iron, holds its shape under heavy loads, lasts longer before it needs to be replaced. The demand for steel rail is, at this moment in American economic history, nearly infinite compared to the capacity to produce it. Every ton of steel that can be produced at a reasonable cost will be sold. The question is, who will produce it at that cost? Meet Andrew Carnegie. He is 33 years old in 1868, not yet in steel, making his money in railroad bonds and bridge construction and oil investments. A man who has spent 15 years cultivating relationships with the railroad executives who will become his customers. and who has been watching the steel industry with the specific attention of someone building a plan rather than simply observing. He has read about the Bessemer converter, a British invention from 1856 that converts pig iron to steel in 20 minutes through a blast of air that burns off carbon and impurities, producing roughly 20 tons per heat rather than the quarter-ton that a skilled puddler produces in a shift. Carnegie has toured Bessemer plants in England. He has done the arithmetic. He understands that whoever builds the first large-scale Bessemer steel operation in America will have a cost structure so far below the existing iron producers that they will be able to price competitively and still generate margins the iron producers cannot match. But Henry Bessemer is not Carnegie's real model. Captain William Jones is. He is Carnegie's plant superintendent at the Edgar Thomson Works, which Carnegie opens in 1875 outside Pittsburgh, and he is the greatest industrial engineer of his generation. Jones approaches the Bessemer process the way a surgeon approaches an operating room. Every movement standardized, every tool in its assigned place, every worker trained to perform a specific task with maximum efficiency and minimum motion. Jones designs the layout of the Edgar Thomson plant so that the flow of material from one stage to the next requires no backtracking, no wasted movement, no unnecessary handling. He introduces the practice of tracking production costs by the minute rather than by the shift, which forces the supervisors and workers to be aware of inefficiency in real time rather than discovering it at the end of a week, when nothing can be done about it. When Jones dies in a furnace explosion in 1889, Carnegie writes that he had no equal in the world as a steel plant manager. He pays Jones's widow a settlement that is more than Carnegie has paid for entire companies. And then there is Henry Clay Frick. He is a coke producer from Connellsville, Pennsylvania, who controls approximately 80% of the coke supply in the region by 1880, and coke is the fuel that Bessemer steel production cannot happen without. Carnegie needs Frick's coke. Frick needs Carnegie's capital to expand. They form a partnership in 1882 that gives Carnegie a controlling interest in Frick's coke operations. It is the first move in the strategy that will define Carnegie's empire, and it is not a supply relationship. It is ownership. Carnegie does not buy coke from Frick. Carnegie owns the coke, and Frick runs the operation that produces it. The distinction is not semantic. It is the entire strategy. What none of them know yet is that the same logic Carnegie applies to coke will ultimately extend backward to the iron ore mines of Minnesota and forward to the railroads that move the ore to the mills, and that the accumulated cost advantage of owning every step will become a weapon no competitor can match. 1882, the Connellsville coke fields, and Carnegie Steel's cost structure begins its long descent below the survival threshold of every competitor in the industry. At first, vertical integration seems obvious. Owning your own coke supply means you never pay a market price for coke during a shortage. Carnegie's competitors, who buy coke from independent producers, watch their costs spike every time a cold winter or a labor dispute tightens the coke supply. Carnegie does not. He has a fixed cost of producing the coke from his own fields, which he can optimize over time, and no exposure to spot market volatility. The competitive advantage is immediate and quantifiable. In the year Carnegie integrates the coke supply, his cost per ton of steel falls by approximately $8. His competitors, buying coke on the open market, have no equivalent lever to pull. The first large customer is the Pennsylvania Railroad, which places an order for 2,000 steel rails at Carnegie's new Edgar Thomson Works in 1875. The superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad is Thomas Scott, who had been Carnegie's patron during his telegraph days and who has watched Carnegie's ascent with the complicated pride of a mentor whose student has outgrown him. The rail order is placed partly on the strength of Carnegie's price, which is lower than any competitor, and partly on the personal relationship. The rails are delivered on time and at spec. Carnegie loses money on the order but gains the reference that wins him every subsequent large railroad contract in the region. He tells every customer the same thing: bring me your order, I will beat anyone's price. He can make this promise because he has a cost structure that nobody else has, and every cost reduction investment he makes widens the gap. When he installs open hearth furnaces in 1888 alongside the Bessemer converters, his per ton cost falls further. When he acquires the Homestead Works, a competitor's mill on the Monongahela in 1883, he installs Jones's efficiency system, and within 2 years the plant's cost per ton falls to match Edgar Thomson's. When Frick expands the coke operations to supply the growing mill capacity, Carnegie gets first call on the coke at internal transfer prices that the external market cannot beat. Within 5 years of opening Edgar Thomson, Carnegie's mills are producing steel rails at a cost that British producers, who still use older equipment and older methods, cannot approach. The British steel industry in 1880 believes, based on its own experience, that the cost floor for Bessemer steel production is around $56 per ton. Carnegie's internal cost figure for the same year is $36. The British calculation is not wrong. It is based on British inputs, British labor, and British plant efficiency. Carnegie's calculation is based on the Edgar Thomson plant, William Jones's production system, and the accumulated advantage of owning his inputs. The two numbers will never converge. By 1890, Carnegie Steel is producing 2,000 tons of steel per day at its Pittsburgh mills. No individual competitor can match the volume or the price. The companies that try to expand to compete face a problem that Carnegie has specifically engineered: the raw material supply. The Connellsville coke fields is mostly his. The transportation links, the railroads running or from Minnesota to Pittsburgh, are either his or controlled by allies. The skilled workforce capable of running Bessemer operations at full efficiency has been trained in Carnegie plants and trained to Carnegie's methods. A new entrant trying to build a competitive steel mill in the early 1890s is not just building a building, it is trying to replicate 20 years of accumulated advantages in inputs, logistics, labor, and process knowledge, and it is trying to do so while competing with a company that has already set the market price at a level that leaves no room for the inefficiencies of a new operation. The peak of Carnegie's industrial power comes in 1900. Mills produce approximately 25% of all the steel in the United States, and his profit for the year is $40 million, approximately $1.4 billion in today's terms, on revenues of less than $200 million. No industrial company in America has ever generated margins like this. Carnegie is 65 years old. He is bored with steel. He wants to give his money away. He has been writing essays about the responsibilities of wealth since 1889. He tells close associates that he plans to retire, to sell Carnegie Steel, and to spend his remaining decades building libraries and concert halls across the English-speaking world. He begins negotiations with several potential buyers. None of them can finance the purchase except J.P. Morgan. This is the top. Nobody knows it yet. Then, in late 1900, Carnegie does something that forces Morgan's hand. He announces that Carnegie Steel will enter the tube and wire rod business, directly competing with several companies in which Morgan has significant ownership interests. He then lets it be known that he is considering building a competing railroad from Pittsburgh to the Atlantic coast to undercut the rates he pays on the Pennsylvania. These are not idle threats. Carnegie has the capital, the operational capacity, and the demonstrated history of following through on exactly this kind of expansion. Morgan understands immediately what the announcements mean. Carnegie is either going to be bought at a price he names, or he is going to destroy several of Morgan's other investments on his way to retirement. The negotiation between Carnegie and Morgan takes place over approximately 2 months in late 1900 and early 1901. Carnegie writes his asking price on a slip of paper, $480 million. Morgan accepts without counteroath. When asked later by a friend whether he thought he was getting a fair deal, Morgan says he has never had an unsatisfactory moment since. Carnegie, for his part, tells the same friend that he made a mistake. He should have asked for $100 million more. Charles Schwab, Carnegie's president of operations, watches the sale from inside the company and feels something he will later describe as grief. A sense that the specific organizational culture, the brutal focus on cost and efficiency and production records, will not survive the transition to a larger corporate structure. He is not wrong. US Steel, the company Morgan creates from Carnegie's mills plus several competitors, never achieves Carnegie's cost structure again. The combination reduces competition but does not improve efficiency. US Steel's profit margins, in its first decade, are consistently below what Carnegie Steel achieved in its last decade as an independent company. Margaret Collins had been working since she was 14 in a boarding house outside the Homestead Works, cooking and washing for the workers who came off the night shift. By 1890, she runs the boarding house herself with her husband and employs 3 women who cook and wash under her direction. The Homestead Strike of 1892, when Carnegie and Frick break the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers in a confrontation that leaves 10 people dead, does not directly affect her livelihood but empties the boarding house for 3 weeks during the lockout and leaves the neighborhood with a tension that never fully dissipates. Several of her regular boarders are among the workers who are blacklisted after the strike and never work at Homestead again. She does not take a political position on what happened. She takes a practical one. She expands her menu to serve the replacement workers who take the blacklisted men's jobs at lower wages. Alexander Holly is Carnegie's other great unsung collaborator, the engineer who designs the Edgar Thomson plant layout in 1873 and who introduces into the American steel industry a series of equipment innovations that individually seem modest and collectively produce the performance gap that Carnegie exploits. Holly designs the first removable bottom for a Bessemer converter, allowing the converter to be relayed for refractories in hours rather than days, which means the furnace can operate continuously rather than shutting down for multi-day repairs. The improvement in uptime is roughly 15%. On a high-volume operation, 15% more uptime is 15% more steel from the same capital investment. Holly does not profit enormously from this work. He dies in 1882 at 48, leaving a modest estate. Carnegie profits from it for the next 2 decades. James Gailey runs Carnegie's chemistry laboratory in the 1880s and early 1890s, analyzing every heat of steel and every batch of raw material to identify quality variations and process improvements. Carnegie is the first industrial steel producer to run systematic chemical analysis on his inputs and outputs, and Gailey's lab produces a steady stream of small improvements that accumulate over the years into a significant cost reduction. The practice of systematic industrial chemistry in steel production is so far ahead of what Carnegie's competitors do that when rival mill owners learn about it, some of them dismiss it as excessive, and still, nobody asks the real question. So what does the conventional story say about Carnegie's success? It says he was a tough businessman who worked hard, took risks, and built a great company through personal determination and talent. That story is not false. It is incomplete in the way that describing a chess grandmaster as someone who moves pieces around a board is technically accurate. What actually happened is that Carnegie identified a specific structural vulnerability in the economics of industrial production, the exposure of integrated producers to input price volatility, and built a systematic solution to it that produced a cost structure his competitors could not match regardless of how hard they worked or how talented they were. Remember, Henry Frick, who starts as a coke producer and becomes Carnegie's partner and then his most important operational executive. By 1899, Frick and Carnegie are no longer on speaking terms. The product of a business dispute about the valuation of Frick's shares in the partnership, a dispute that ends with Carnegie attempting to force Frick out at below-market prices and Frick taking Carnegie to court. Frick is eventually bought out at a price closer to fair value after threatening further litigation. He spends the rest of his life collecting art, building a mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York that is now the Frick Collection, and refusing to acknowledge Carnegie's existence. The partnership that built Carnegie Steel's most important competitive advantage ends in a mutual contempt that neither man ever resolves. The mechanism of Carnegie's advantage runs through 4 interconnected cost reductions, each of which compounds the others. The first is input cost stability. Owning the coke fields means the coke price is a managed internal cost rather than a volatile market price. The second is transportation cost. Owning or controlling the rail and water routes that move or from Minnesota to Pittsburgh eliminates the middleman margin on the single largest logistical cost in the process. The third is process efficiency. Jones's management system and Holly's equipment innovations reduce the labor and energy cost per ton below what competitors achieve with the same capital investment. The fourth is reinvestment velocity. Carnegie's profits go back into the plants faster than competitors reinvest, compounding the efficiency advantage year by year. Each of these is powerful individually. Combined and compounded over 20 years, they produce a cost. The new paradigm of the Carnegie era is the belief, shared across the industrial economy of the 1870s and 1880s, that the natural state of industrial competition is many producers of roughly equal scale, competing on quality and relationship and geography, and that any one producer growing dominant in an industry will attract competitive entry that restores balance. Carnegie's experience demolishes this belief. He grows so dominant so fast that the capital cost of matching his scale, combined with the time required to build equivalent operational capabilities, makes competitive entry financially irrational. By the time any competitor builds a Bessemer plant large enough to match Carnegie's output, Carnegie has already reduced his costs further, and the new entrant is competing at a structural disadvantage from day one. Easy money is the low-cost capital that Carnegie's established. reputation and demonstrated profitability allows him to access through the 1880s and 1890s, at a time when most industrial companies struggle to get bank financing for expansion. Carnegie reinvests his profits rather than distributing them, and he borrows against his plants at rates his smaller competitors cannot match. The combination of retained earnings reinvestment and favorable debt terms funds an expansion cycle that the rest of the industry watches but cannot replicate. Social proof is the roster of Carnegie's customers, which by 1885 includes every major railroad in America: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Union Pacific, all by Carnegie Rails. Each reference makes the next customer easier to close. By 1890, the question is not whether to buy from Carnegie but at what price, and on price Carnegie always wins. Complexity is the internal transfer pricing system that Carnegie uses to allocate costs between his coke operations, his or mines, his railroads, and his mills in ways that allow him to report cost figures that are accurate for his purposes but that competitors, who do not have integrated operations, cannot verify or replicate. A competitor trying to determine whether Carnegie's quoted price covers his actual costs cannot do the calculation because the inputs to the calculation are internal to Carnegie's enterprise, and not publicly disclosed. Euphoria arrives with Carnegie's 1900 profit of $40 million, a number so large that it shocks even the bankers who follow Carnegie closely and who thought they had a good model of his profitability. The warning that nobody in Carnegie's circle wants to acknowledge is that the scale and market power that produces the $40 million profit is precisely what makes the sale to Morgan necessary and inevitable. A company with 25% of American steel production is too large for any private owner to hold indefinitely in a country developing antitrust law. The Sherman Act passed in 1890, the Morgan buyout and the creation of US Steel in 1901 is, among other things, a race to consolidate before the government consolidates the consolidation question on different terms. The trigger that forces the Morgan negotiation is Carnegie's threat to build the two plants and the competing railroad, moves that would cost Morgan's other investments hundreds of millions of dollars. The blame game that follows Carnegie Steel is the antitrust litigation around US Steel, which the Department of Justice files in 1911 on the theory that the Morgan consolidation is itself an illegal restraint of trade. The Supreme Court rules in US Steel's favor in 1920, finding that size alone does not constitute a monopoly. But the questions raised in that litigation, about whether vertical integration produces competition-destroying market power or merely efficient production, are still being litigated in different courts. About different companies in 2025. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now look at 2025. Amazon's retail marketplace charges third-party sellers fees averaging 34 cents on every dollar of sales, a figure published in an FTC report filed in 2023. Amazon simultaneously runs its own retail operations that compete with those third-party sellers, using the data generated by the marketplace to identify which products are selling well, and then introducing Amazon Basics versions at lower prices. Amazon Web Services, which runs the cloud infrastructure that many of those third-party sellers use to operate their businesses, generates operating profit margins of approximately 37%. Amazon owns the last-mile delivery infrastructure that competes with FedEx and UPS for the packages those sellers ship. The vertical integration of marketplace, cloud, logistics, and private label retail produces a cost and data advantage that no competitor operating in only one of those layers can match. Sound familiar? New paradigm. The current version is the argument that digital platforms are different from industrial monopolies because they offer zero-price services to consumers, and that consumer welfare, not competitor welfare, is the appropriate measure of monopoly harm. This argument, which has dominated American antitrust enforcement since Robert Bork articulated it in the 1970s, has allowed vertical integration and technology to proceed at a scale that would have triggered antitrust action under the standards applied to US Steel in 1911. The European Commission, operating under a different legal standard, has fined Google €8.25 billion across 3 cases since 2017 for conduct that US antitrust authorities have not challenged. Easy money is the decade of near-zero interest rates between 2009 and 2022 that allowed Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, and Microsoft to issue debt at minimal cost and acquire companies in adjacent markets at a pace that would have been financially constrained under normal rate environments. Amazon alone made 91 acquisitions between 2010 and 2022, including Whole Foods, MGM, and Zappos, each one extending its vertical integration into a new supply or distribution layer. Social proof is every small business that builds its customer base on Amazon, Instagram, or Google and then faces the platform, raising its fees or changing its algorithm because the switching cost of leaving the platform, in the form of lost customer relationships and brand recognition, exceeds the cost of the fee increase. Carnegie's customers faced the same dynamic in reverse. Switching to a competitor meant giving up the price advantage that buying from the dominant producer provided. Complexity is the internal pricing structure of large technology platforms, which set the fees charged to third-party sellers, app developers, and advertisers in ways that are opaque to the people paying them and structured to extract the maximum amount the market will bear at each layer of the vertical stack. A small merchant selling on Amazon cannot determine whether the logistics fees, the advertising costs, the storage fees, and the marketplace commission together leave a viable margin without running the numbers themselves, and Amazon's internal models for setting those fees are not disclosed. What is genuinely different now? Carnegie produced physical goods and physical plants that could be located, measured, taxed, and regulated by governments that had geographic jurisdiction over them. The digital platforms produce and distribute products that exist primarily as data, cross borders without physical transit, and can locate their revenue recognition in jurisdictions that impose minimal taxation. The jurisdictional arbitrage available to digital vertical integrators is not available to a steel mill in Pittsburgh, and it represents a real structural difference in the regulatory environment that makes Carnegie-style antitrust remedies harder to apply, slower to implement, and less likely to produce the efficiency outcomes that the Carnegie case eventually produced when US steel's dominance eroded under competitive pressure from regional mills in the 1920s and 1930s. Watch for any company where the gross margin on its platform or infrastructure business significantly exceeds the gross margin on its product business that competes on the same platform. That spread is the Carnegie Coke advantage expressed in software terms. Owning the input that competitors must buy generates returns unavailable to the companies competing on top of it. Watch for acquisitions by dominant platforms of companies that are early leaders in markets adjacent to the platform's core business, because the Carnegie pattern of extending integration into inputs before competitors can establish them is visible in acquisition history. And watch for regulatory filings in the EU Digital Markets Act designation proceedings, because the DMA's gatekeeper designations are the first attempt by a major regulatory authority to apply Carnegie-era thinking to digital vertical integration, and the outcome of those enforcement actions will shape the next decade of technology competition. Not predictions. A pattern. The pattern is there. The question is whether you will recognize it in time. So why do we keep building markets that produce Carnegie-level dominance and then spend decades arguing about what to do about it? The answer is that vertical integration is genuinely efficient. Carnegie's mills produced steel more cheaply than his competitors. Amazon's logistics network delivers packages more cheaply than independent competitors. Google's search engine returns better results than competitors could manage with equivalent resources. The efficiency is real. The problem is that efficiency and competition are not the same thing, and a market structure that produces maximum efficiency in the short run can produce minimum competition in the long run, and minimum competition in the long run tends to produce declining innovation, rising prices, and reduced quality once the competitive pressure that originally drove the efficiency gains is gone. What they lacked was not effort but the specific strategic insight that Carnegie had, that the way to win in an industry where demand is growing faster than supply is not to compete on the terms the industry currently runs on but to change the cost structure so fundamentally that the existing terms become irrelevant. Carnegie did not try to make better pig iron than his competitors. He built a different production system, owned the inputs to that system, and priced at a level his different cost structure could sustain and his competitors could not. The messenger boy who arrived in Pittsburgh at 13 with nothing carries with him, from that experience, a specific understanding of what it feels like to be at the bottom of an economic hierarchy with no structural advantage. Everything he builds is designed to create a structural advantage that effort alone cannot overcome. The irony is that the structural advantage he creates becomes so complete that it eventually removes from the market the kind of competitive pressure that produced him in the first place. Carnegie sees this. In his old age he describes the competitive conditions of his early career as the best education a businessman can receive and worries, in private letters, that us Steele's dominance removes that education from the next generation of industrial managers. He is right to worry. The great innovation in American steel does not come from Pittsburgh after Carnegie. It comes from the mini-mills in the 1960s and 1970s, from companies with no Carnegie-era advantages, competing in a market segment that US Steel has allowed to stagnate because its vertical integration gives it no reason to innovate there. Now I want to hear from you. Which current company do you think has built the most complete vertical integration across its industry? In the Carnegie sense of owning inputs, production, and distribution simultaneously? And at what point does vertical integration stop being efficiency and start being a barrier that prevents the kind of competitive entry that produces the next generation of innovation? Those are not the same question, and the answers point in different directions. Drop your analysis in the comments. If this changed how you think about the cost structures behind the prices you pay, hit the like button and subscribe. Next time, we are going inside the story of how a single Dutch trading company became the first corporation in history to sell shares to the public, built a private army larger than most national militaries, and then collapsed in a scandal that destroyed the Dutch government with it. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming loud. See you in the next one. 2018.